I first came across the work of Ernest Morrell early on in my teaching career. I was working in a residential facility in Los Angeles, where most of my students were caught up in the juvenile detention system. One of my mentor teachers at the time gave me a copy of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and this really prepared me for an article that Morrell wrote, which was about using popular culture text in the English language arts classroom. When it comes to the school subject English language arts and critical literacy, Morrell is at the top of the list. I would say that this is first because of his tenacious scholarship and passion for literacy and marginalized communities, but I would also add that Morrell is very much a bridge builder, even with his critical stances. Some of this I think is strategic, but I also get a sense that Morrell is truly convinced in the project of deliberative democracy. Morrell is a highly decorated scholar and the Coyle Professor of Literacy Education at Notre Dame. Before his current appointment, he also held positions at Columbia Teachers College, University of California, Berkeley, University of San Francisco, UCLA, and Michigan State University. Before all this, Dr. Morrell started out as an English teacher in Oakland, which he references many times in his work. Morrell's published work is mostly in literacy education research, but his range of scholarship covers a lot of territory, including critical media literacy, teacher research, racial equality in education. His most recent publication, he was editor of Educating Harlem, A Century of Schooling and Resistance in a Black Community. Morrell presented his book at the Teachers College celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Harlem Renaissance. I think that this book reflects the importance of resistance that is often missing in dominant historical narratives. One of his most widely known books is Critical Literacy and Urban Youth, packed with curriculum and social theory, along with case studies from Morrell's own teaching and others. Morrell's style is quite reflexive, and he makes no bones about being personally engaged with the subjects of his study, most often secondary English students. And this is integral to his theoretical framework and methodologies that we'll look at now.
It is hip-hop that taught me that I was living lyric. So while many of you were sitting in the comfort of your well-decorated adolescent bedrooms, being read to stories about mystical creatures from desolate places, I was learning that I was one. Raised in what was considered to be the trenches, white picket fences didn't exist, just redlining to fence in institutionally defenseless communities of color, overpopulated by single mothers and three-door hoopties, raising 3 kids alone as fathers wait in prison, envisioning a world where they are not always drowning in the feathers of a Jim Crow. The worst part is, this becomes the only story ever told, regurgitated in textbooks that lack the context to attest to the complex narratives that exist just beyond the schools, who told us that learning could only happen in classrooms. History doesn't teach about the lesson plans happening in the back seats of three-door hoopties, or how the mystical creatures from desolate places learn to cope, how they turn red lines into bass lines, bars into bars, how they turn living into lyric, and lyric gave life right back. The reciprocity of respiration. Hip-hop is breathing in shitty situations and exhaling possibilities. It is hearing the narratives told about your community and daring to say no. So while many of you were sitting in the comfort of your well-decorated adolescent bedrooms, being read to stories about fiction and fantasy, I was learning how to write my own humanity in a way that fit the tempo of my own heartbeat, scratched and skipping. The first story I was ever told was played over the repetition of an 808. I turned my pen into a sword and slayed the dragons in classrooms and books. I wrote hooks about poverty, but never about being poor. I poured myself into my words and watched them spill all over and everywhere. There are black and brown kids who don't want to be activists. They just want to be the protagonists for once. They want to assemble a script of their stories and watch themselves come back to life. Hip-hop is a reincarnation of self. It is taking everything that died in your community and trying to make something out of the ashes. It is taking what little you have and daring to call it magic or mysticism or real. Hip-hop is showing people that they are real, that they are an archive of living and loving and something other than mystical creatures from desolate places. It is silence in the back seat of a three-door hoopty, breathing in a living lyric that may sound a lot different from yours, but at least you got to hear it. At least you got to breathe.
In the tradition of Paulo Freire and critical pedagogy, Morrell posits a critical literacy that deals with the linguistic and textual processes involved in uncovering and subverting dominant cultural ideologies that are presented as truths. Speaking about Freire properly identifies the starting point of critical literacy education as the lived experiences of everyday people. Morrell believes that critical theory loses its power and its purpose if it's not employed at the ground level, or as he says, uninterrogated by the world. And so his work largely tries to be critical about critical theory to ensure that it stays focused on real classrooms, real neighborhoods, and institutions of power. Morrell says, time is of the essence, and that pedagogy is the ultimate tool of revolutionary change. Clearly, Morrell believes that critical literacy fosters both resistance and agency. One thing I really appreciate about Dr. Morrell is that his insights on teacher research comes out of his personal experience. During the 6 years he was doing his graduate studies, he worked as a high school English language arts teacher. Most likely, this is the reason that he developed such an integrative praxis. Morrell mentions that he was appalled as a new teacher to see the disconnect between in-school and out-of-school literacies of his students, and that the curriculum and practices he saw were doing very little to address this divide. He saw how his students were deeply involved in all sorts of literacies. Not only were these students engaged in many reading literacies, Morrell discovered that they were also producing literacies in their cultural practices outside of school: street art, fashion, and music subcultures, from hip-hop to punk. These students were navigating and resisting the dominant world around them, just not in school. Morrell began to work on bringing these literacies into the classroom, something now known as culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. Morrell says that when he was first getting started, he saw this mostly as a one-way bridge to bring in the local to the academic, meaning a means to an end to help give students access to the literacies of power. This approach reminds me a little bit of the earlier work of Lisa Delpit, who also felt that marginalized students needed explicit instruction in what she called the codes of power, meaning dominant cultural discourse and academic language. This view has been critiqued by other theorists as giving in too much to the hegemonic official knowledge. However, over time, Morrell expanded these ideas to a more critical literacy view, which maintains the focus on developing academic literacies, but at the same time draws upon the students' funds of knowledge, or cultural literacies, to deconstruct dominant narratives and prepare texts that advocate for individual freedom and social transformation. So instead of just using street literacies, quote unquote, to gain academic proficiency, Morrell designed a year-long curriculum to make connections between youth literacies and academic ones. Between is the key word here because it removes the notions that dominant literacies are of greater value. Literacy discourses are about the relationships to power. So in this sense, mastering dominant academic literacies is integral to critical literacy objectives. But to access higher paying jobs or attending university is a byproduct, not the sole objective. So is participating in civic life as voters, activists, or even holding public offices. However, Morrell also talks about the consequences of an exclusive focus on dominant literacies, and that traditional academic instruction can alienate and exclude members of culturally marginalized groups. Critical literacy is concerned about the cost of students losing the opportunity to learn about their own culture or the cultures of other marginalized groups. Morrell is concerned that these students are treated by the system as pathological and as deficits, and teachers under this mindset fail to make meaningful links between their students' local language and literacy practices and the literacies needed to more effectively navigate the discourses of power. The dominant discourses surrounding literacy instruction usually treat literacy as neutral or a decontextualized skill set. They don't take into account that literacies are multiple, situated, ideological, and tied to power relations in society. For English language arts teachers, Morrell says, all literacy educators make political choices that carry with them significant social, economic, cultural, political, and psychological consequences. So, as a curriculum theorist, Morrell is very much in the vein of Michael Apple, Henry Giroux, and the culturally relevant work of Gloria Ladson-Billings. But he says that the literary aspects of critical tradition can be seen as far back as 2,500 years ago. So in his book, Critical Literacy in Urban Youth, he does a survey of Western philosophy going all the way back from the ancient Greeks all the way up to post-structuralism. Throughout this particular book, Morrell emphasizes critical theorists such as Gramsci and the Frankfurt School. I found this part of Morrell's work fascinating because he hones in on how each of these philosophical movements can provide insights into critical theory, and specifically critical literacy in language arts. For example, in examining the ideas of Foucault, Morrell describes his idea that any historical analysis of any particular term or concept will reveal how it changes and shifts in the different historical periods or cultural contexts. This is important because it reveals that meanings aren't fixed, that they change, and they're constructed within existing relations of power. Morrell thinks this is important because it moves beyond just the critique of oppression and shows how human actors shape history even as they are shaped by the order of discourse within which they themselves are shaped. This idea becomes a big part of Morrell's curriculum work on the ground, especially in youth participatory action research, where students directly engage with issues in their own communities and produce their own counter stories, texts, and other media. Morrell also pays specific attention to what he calls othered traditions, those of African American, indigenous voices, ethnic studies, subaltern, third world studies, and post-colonial studies. For example, with Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Teresa Perry, he examines relationships between language, literacy, and emancipation. Morrell describes his approach as a combination of grounded theory, post-structural ethnography, and critical teacher research. Morrell continued to work within a grounded theory framework while exploring other methodologies for curriculum. Here's what Morrell has to say about the benefits of critical youth literacy. Quote, "At the time that urban youth find themselves in these constraining conditions, they are also uniquely positioned to enact a critical literacy praxis that would promote meaningful societal change, even as they set in motion a life of personal freedom. As young people, they inherit a tradition of activism and dissent that has fostered countless cultural and social revolutions in the United States and abroad. Given that critical literacy incorporates and subsumes traditional literacies that are frequently taught in schools, the urban literacy classroom becomes the ideal location for a critical literacy education that will lead toward engaged citizenship and personal emancipation." Morrell did this kind of work in very interesting ways. He paired text with films, for example, The Odyssey and The Godfather. His poetry unit had students bringing in lyricists they were familiar with those explored against more canonical works. With Richard Wright's Native Son, they explored issues of racialized discourses of power. But here, Morrell was building authentic dialogue centered on real problems and concerns in the community. His ethnography of his teacher research is shared in several of his books and articles to show that critical literacy practices can happen even in restrictive classroom environments.